Punk is a subculture that grew from the grit and filth of the streets. And as it grew, so too would its enemies, powerful enemies that would stop at nothing to denounce and destroy the movement. Today we'll be looking at how the youth would fight against society and themselves to preserve themselves and destroy society. So why did the UK rebellion begin? In the mid-1970s, Great Britain underwent a terrible recession, which sent hard-working working-class families down to the breadline. Fathers failed to feed families and things got tougher, and while the people who pushed the country along were pulled deeper into poverty and the powerful sat back and watched, young people who lived on the bottom watched tensions rise and family occasions such as Christmas shrink. In 1976, a renowned heatwave would arrive, which would see £500 million worth of crops fail and food prices soar by 12%. This, along with the dissatisfaction of the future and a mainstream music scene that was out of touch and too clean, gave way to a subculture that kicked down the doors that were supposed to remain closed and shoved an anti-establishment anarchistic ideology in the face of the establishment. When the pioneers of punk music began their assault on the mainstream, it sent shocks through society from the bottom eventually to the top. Some of the first notable martyrs that were driven by the forming culture were the Stooges, the Clash, and of course, the Sex Pistols. Punk music was a spit in the face of the clean, peppy, expected music that was lip-synced on top of the pops. It was louder, less tame, and largely anti-establishment. Punk music punched the veneer of off-tradition's teeth and gave rock an unexpected kick. The subculture would mimic this musical fireball of anti-everything and style themselves to any extreme that they could, occasionally hanging around the bus and train stations so all the world could see this explosion of colour, political symbolism, and redirection of style. Punk from the foundation was designed to be a podium for the lower class to preach against a growing partition between real life and mainstream perception. They didn't need to hold protests. They, in attitude, intellect, and attire, were the protest.
We got something to say and we carry a good melody.
In the face of this onslaught, the media reacted and directed their influence against the mob that were forming on the streets. The newspaper called punks an army of faithful fans, dancing to songs of hate and death. Once the media had fired article after article into the impressionable minds of the older generation, many local authorities placed bans on live performances by groups like the Sex Pistols in local council halls. Article writers and politicians consecutively made statements chastising those who support the selling of certain punk albums. As the criticism climbed higher, more young people couldn't help but catch light of the fight against tradition and conformity and rushed to take up arms against the establishment and their parents. The media layered the controversy and hysteria thick, and this wore the punks' patience thin. In retaliation, punks would be even more provocative and go even further to stoke the media bonfire. One major strike and a great example of how far punk was willing to go was the Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen. This song was a very blatant insult to those who possess inherited power. While the focal point is Queen Elizabeth II, it also insults the older population, who are referred to as dreaming. This song was a shot through the traditional English idealism that the parents and grandparents of these young rebels envisioned in their simple, blissful lives. An attack on the Queen was not only incredibly fearless, but also extremely provocative, so much so that the British Broadcasting Corporation and IBA refused to play the record, subsequently making it the most sought-after and popular record in the UK at the time. One of the greatest insults to the establishment, illegal drugs, ran through the movement fiercely, and many young punks would fall away and lose their lives to addiction. The pulse of punk was originally born in the USA and ran through the streets of New York. Patti Smith, Iggy Pop, and the Ramones all joined the punk fun and spun records that were out of the norm and appealing to the unconventional, young, frustrated, and angsty Americans. American punk was inspired by a run-down state of a very different New York and grew from garage bands and alternative clubs. New York today is a fairly clean, fairly well-kept city with a lot of extravagance, but this is a fairly new development. In the late 20th century, New York was a war zone riddled with crime, drugs, and overall filth. Abandoned, rat-infested factories juxtaposed by gleaming towers of glass. It was only natural that someone would notice the irony. Many young punks who felt outcast found refuge in the broken down, abandoned buildings of the city. These rebel rat nests were infested with drug addiction and disease, which stirred the over-eager martyr making media into overdrive, painting the face of punk as a drug-fueled virus that infects young, simple urban and suburban youths and destroys their civil minds. The hellish havens bred antisocial behavior and gave a bad name to punk, which was good, and the desired image of the movement, which was now seen as a socially destructive force and a threat to a respectable and peaceful society. Punk spread across North America fast, and quickly became a stitch in the common scene. Every city and town had a punk. On the 2nd of February 1979, the Sex Pistols' bass guitarist and well-known face of punk, Sid Vicious, would suffer a drug overdose like so many and die, cold and alone. This was a dent, but not the end. Although the Sex Pistols were out of the fight, others pressed onward, trying to preserve the flame and image. More and more punk bands became more and more commercial. Slowly, American punk branched off from English, taking on a more glam and less gloom energy. It became commercial and less controversial. Punk in the USA had been dismantled and defaced from the inside. Greed bled through eventually and sullied the subculture's style and sound. However, it would take a lot more firepower to annihilate a generation's discontent. The survivors of punk would go on to create a new wave of punk-inspired music and fashion. The punks began a tirade with an untamed explosion of alienation, attitude, and anger, but eventually ended with a whimper. Like every war eventually ends. On whose terms is debatable. This assault on society was new and different than other subcultures that had come before. Fought out on the field of culture, it would leave an immovable mark on the society it wished to change.